What unfolds when a sharp-tongued talk show host attempts to diminish the accomplishments of a powerhouse entrepreneur on live television? Simone Jackson's response left the entire audience stunned into silence. Simone Jackson wasn't just another businesswoman, she was a visionary, a trailblazer who had carved out her own empire from the ground up by the age of. But her success was never just about personal gain. It was about creating opportunities, lifting others up, and making a tangible difference in her community. Raised in Birmingham, Alabama, Simone had always believed that true success wasn't measured solely by personal achievements, but by the doors one could open for others. Her latest endeavor was a groundbreaking initiative designed to empower young Black women by providing them with access to entrepreneurial mentorship and essential resources. When she received an invitation to appear on The Morning Perspective, one of the most widely watched talk shows in the country, she was elated. This was her chance to shine a light on the young women whose lives were being transformed through her initiative. It was an opportunity to showcase the power of resilience, talent, and community support. The show's host, Charlene Whitaker, was a polarizing figure, a woman whose sharp tongue and no-nonsense interviewing style had earned her both admiration and notoriety. Known for her ability to stir controversy, Charlene was as respected as she was feared. But Simone wasn't intimidated. She had faced far greater challenges than a confrontational interviewer. This was her moment, and she was ready to seize it. On the day of the interview, Simone stepped into the Los Angeles studio with the same confidence that had built her empire. She wore a striking teal suit, a color as bold as her spirit, radiating both power and grace. As she sat in the makeup chair, the artist complimented her glowing appearance. Simone smiled, feeling the familiar rush of nerves bubbling beneath her composed exterior. Stepping onto the brightly lit stage, she inhaled deeply, taking in the energy of the room. The studio buzzed with activity, producers giving last-minute instructions, cameras adjusting their focus, and the quiet murmur of the live audience settling into their seats. Across from her, Charlene sat in her usual spot, her wide, toothy smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen, Simone Jackson," Charlene announced, her voice dripping with both charm and challenge. Applause filled the room as Simone took her seat. "A self-made entrepreneur who claims she's redefining the business world," Charlene continued. "Simone, welcome." With her signature grace, Simone leaned forward slightly, her warm smile unwavering. "Thank you, Charlene. It's an honor to be here and to share the incredible work we're doing." The first few minutes of the interview were smooth. Simone eloquently recounted her journey, from a determined teenager selling handcrafted jewelry at flea markets to the CEO of a thriving multi-million-dollar enterprise. Charlene listened, nodding at the appropriate moments, occasionally interjecting with questions. Yet something in her tone had begun to shift. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but Simone, ever perceptive, could feel the undercurrents changing. She could sense the weight of what was coming next. The compliments had started to take on an almost imperceptible edge, the kind that wasn't entirely genuine. There was a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable. Charlene tilted her head in that exaggeratedly curious manner she was famous for, her voice laced with an almost playful skepticism. "So, Simone," she drawled, "do you think programs like yours are really necessary? I mean, isn't success just a matter of hard work? Are these initiatives needed because, well, people aren't working hard enough on their own?" A hush settled over the room, thick and heavy, the energy shifting just slightly. Simone held her ground, unshaken by the pointed nature of the question. She took a measured breath, her expression unwaveringly composed. "Well, Charlene," she began, her voice even but firm, "this isn't about people not working hard enough. It's about acknowledging the real, systemic obstacles that exist and ensuring that everyone, regardless of their background, has access to opportunities that allow them to succeed despite those barriers." Her words were met with a smattering of polite applause from the audience, but Simone could see the glint in Charlene's eyes, the kind that signaled she had just been given the perfect opening. Charlene's smile only widened as though she had been lying in wait for precisely this moment. But what Simone didn't yet realize was just how far Charlene was willing to go. Leaning forward slightly, her fingers drumming against the sleek, polished surface of the table, Charlene's voice took on an air of feigned understanding. "I hear you," she said with a nod that seemed more rehearsed than heartfelt. "But don't you think that focusing so much on systemic barriers can sometimes sound like an excuse? I mean, plenty of people manage to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, don't they? Isn't that what the American dream is all about?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Some clapped in agreement, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Simone caught glimpses of furrowed brows, crossed arms, and sidelong glances exchanged among the crowd. But she remained still, her hands resting lightly on the table, her heart steady. She had been here before? Maybe not under the glare of national television cameras, but in classrooms where she had to justify her ambitions, in boardrooms where she had to prove she belonged, in family gatherings where people debated the same tired arguments as if they were unshakable truths. This wasn't new. She inhaled slowly, then exhaled just as steadily, allowing a small, knowing smile to play on her lips. "Charlene," she said, her voice warm but unyielding, "the idea of the American dream is a beautiful one, on paper. In theory, it paints a picture of boundless opportunity, where anyone, no matter their beginnings, can rise to the top through sheer determination. But that vision doesn't account for reality. It doesn't acknowledge that for some the climb is steeper, the road rockier, and the obstacles far greater." She let the words sink in for a moment before continuing, her eyes locking onto Charlene's. "A good pair of boots is great, but what happens when those boots come with no laces? Or worse, when they're stolen before you even get a chance to wear them?" A burst of laughter and applause erupted from a section of the audience, cutting through the tension. Simone saw a few approving nods, a handful of people leaning in, drawn to the conversation in a new way. She seized the momentum, her voice carrying both conviction and warmth. "What my program does," she added, her tone unwavering, "is give people their laces back. It doesn't tie their shoes for them, and it certainly doesn't carry them to the finish line. But it makes sure they have what they need to take that first step." Charlene's smile tightened just slightly, the edges of her expression taut with something unspoken. Her eyes flickered toward the next set of questions, but Simone could see it, the slightest crack in the carefully curated persona. Behind the cameras, the producers shifted, their eyes flickering between screens, as if silently strategizing Charlene's next move. Simone had landed a powerful point, but Charlene was not the kind of host to back down easily. "Well," Charlene said, her voice laced with artificial sweetness, though a subtle edge sharpened its undertone. "That's a clever analogy, Simone, but some might argue that focusing so much on race and inequality only deepens the divide. Don't you think we should be prioritizing unity instead of constantly highlighting our differences?" Simone tilted her head slightly, her expression composed but reflective, her words chosen with precision. "Unity is a beautiful concept," she acknowledged, "but you can't build a bridge without first recognizing the river you're trying to cross. Pretending differences don't exist doesn't erase them. It just leaves people stranded on opposite shores, unable to reach one another." A wave of applause rippled through the audience, louder than before. For the briefest moment, Charlene's polished demeanor flickered, her carefully maintained mask slipping just enough to reveal a trace of surprise. But ever the professional, she quickly recovered, her tone shifting to something even more pointed. "That's fair," she conceded, offering a tight-lipped smile. "But let's talk specifics. Your program is designed exclusively for young black women. Why not open it up to everyone? Isn't that, in itself, exclusionary?" Simone felt a familiar spark of irritation but refused to let it show. This question had followed her everywhere, echoed by people who either didn't understand or simply refused to acknowledge the necessity of focused solutions for marginalized communities. Her voice remained steady, unwavering. "It's not exclusionary," she said, her tone calm but firm. "It's intentional. When you identify where the gaps are, you address them directly. If a house has a leak in the roof, you don't tear down the entire building. You start by fixing the part that's broken. She let the words settle in before continuing, her gaze unwavering. My program targets a specific need, and in doing so, it strengthens entire communities. When you lift those who have been historically left behind, you don't just help them. You create ripples of change that benefit everyone. Applause rang out once more, the energy in the room shifting, tilting unmistakably in Simone's favor. But Charlene wasn't finished. Leaning back in her chair, she crossed her arms, adopting a posture that suggested she was settling in for a battle. "Well," she said, her tone laced with both skepticism and an almost performative curiosity, "I'm just playing devil's advocate here, but some might argue that programs like yours encourage dependency. What do you say to that?" Simone raised an eyebrow, a faint smile dancing at the corners of her lips. She knew exactly what Charlene was doing, poking, prodding, attempting to stir the pot. But if she was expecting Simone to waver, to falter, she was in for a disappointment. Even as she kept her outward composure, Simone could feel the tension in the room thickening, pressing in from all sides. This was the moment that could shift the entire narrative. But if Charlene thought she had backed Simone into a corner, she had severely underestimated her. Simone held her gaze steady, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. "Dependency," she repeated, her tone measured, yet carrying the weight of something deeper, something unshakable. "Let me ask you something, Charlene. When banks provide loans to entrepreneurs trying to start a business, is that promoting dependency? Or is it giving people the resources they need to grow and succeed?" Charlene parted her lips, preparing to respond, but Simone wasn't finished. "Because that's exactly what my program does. It's an investment. It equips young women with the tools they need to stand on their own, to carve out their own paths, and to create opportunities not just for themselves, but for others as well." She leaned forward slightly, her words charged with conviction. "The issue isn't dependency, Charlene. The issue is lack of opportunity." The room erupted. The applause was thunderous, rolling through the studio with a force that was impossible to ignore. Even some of the production crew, normally stoic and focused, were nodding along, their expressions betraying quiet agreement. Charlene's expression tightened, the carefully curated mask beginning to crack. She shifted in her seat, crossing her legs tightly, her movements more rigid than before. When she spoke again, her voice was noticeably clipped, as though she were trying to regain control. "Well, Simone," she said, her words deliberate, "you make a compelling argument, but surely you can understand why some people feel left out when programs are designed with such a narrow focus. We live in a time where inclusion is more important than ever. Don't you think initiatives like yours should be open to everyone?" Simone's smile faded, not out of frustration but out of a quiet, unwavering determination. She laced her fingers together, leaning forward just slightly, her eyes locked onto Charlene's. "Charlene," she said, her voice softer now, yet filled with unshakable conviction, "inclusion matters, but it doesn't mean ignoring the realities that people face." Simone's expression remained poised, yet her eyes burned with quiet intensity. She had heard this argument before, this attempt to twist fairness into favoritism, to reduce justice to mere division. But she was prepared. "If a child is struggling in school," she said, her voice unwavering, "you don't hold the entire class back just so that everyone feels equal. You give that child extra support so they can catch up. And when they do, when they reach their full potential, the entire classroom thrives because of it." A charged silence followed, stretching through the studio like the weight of an undeniable truth. But Charlene was not one to concede easily. She leaned back, a slow smirk tugging at her lips, her eyes gleaming with a challenge that had made her infamous. "Interesting perspective," she mused, her voice light, almost casual, but laced with something sharper beneath the surface. "But let me ask you this, Simone. Don't you think focusing so much on race actually, fuels division? Wouldn't it be better to concentrate on what unites us?" Simone opened her mouth to respond, but Charlene pressed forward, her next words slicing through the air like a blade. Some might even say that programs like yours are just another form of segregation. Isn't that ironic? A gasp rippled through the audience. A few people audibly murmured their disbelief, while others shook their heads in silent protest. For the first time, a flicker of raw emotion crossed Simone's face, a brief but undeniable blend of incredulity and quiet frustration. She glanced toward the crowd, drawing strength from their visible reactions, before turning her full focus back to Charlene. "What's ironic," Simone said, her voice steady but carrying a deep, unshakable weight, "is how people twist the idea of equity into something it's not." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Each word landed with the weight of generations behind it. "Charlene, segregation was about exclusion. It was about locking people out, denying them opportunities, telling them they didn't belong. What I'm doing is the exact opposite. I'm opening doors that were slammed shut for generations." She paused, letting the words hang in the air like a truth too powerful to ignore. "And do you know what's really ironic?" she continued, her gaze locked onto Charlene. "That when people like me try to fix the damage those systems caused, we're called divisive. But the truth is, we can't heal a wound if we refuse to admit it exists." The studio erupted. Applause thundered through the room, some audience members rising to their feet, their faces alight with agreement, with validation, with something more than just support, recognition. Charlene's expression faltered for the briefest of moments, a split-second flicker of something unreadable before she schooled her features back into a strained smile. She had miscalculated. The energy in the room had shifted, the momentum slipping from her grip. For a moment it was clear she was scrambling to regain control, to wrestle back the upper hand. Charlene sat back, crossing her arms, her expression composed but her frustration flickering beneath the surface. "Well, Simone," she said, her voice still smooth but now carrying a sharper edge, "you certainly have an answer for everything." She tilted her head, as if leveling a final challenge. "But let's be real for a second. There are hard-working, struggling people out there, people who are barely getting by, who might look at what you're doing and wonder, what about us?" Charlene's words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. How do you justify leaving them behind? How is that fair? For the first time, a flicker of something unreadable crossed Simone's face. Not anger, not frustration, but a quiet, restrained intensity. Her jaw tightened, just for a moment, before her expression shifted into something softer yet infinitely stronger. She wasn't shaken. She wasn't thrown off course. She leaned forward, her voice carrying a weight that made the entire room feel smaller, more intimate, as if she were speaking directly to each person watching. "Fair," she said, repeating the word with a deliberate pause. Then, locking eyes with Charlene, she continued, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. "Charlene, let me ask you something. When a firefighter rushes to put out a burning house, do we accuse them of being unfair to the houses that aren't on fire, or do we thank them for saving the neighborhood?" The air in the studio shifted. It wasn't the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of realization, of an audience holding their breath, waiting to see what came next. Even the production crew, who had been moving quietly behind the cameras, were now completely still, their eyes locked on Simone. "That's what this program is," Simone pressed on, her voice unwavering. "It's about putting out fires. It's about addressing the needs of those who have been ignored, overlooked, and left to struggle alone for far too long. And when we lift them up, when we give them the tools to thrive, it doesn't take anything away from anyone else. It strengthens the entire community." Charlene inhaled sharply, parting her lips as if to counter, but Simone raised a hand, not harshly, but with enough quiet authority to make it clear she wasn't done speaking. "And let's be honest," Simone continued, her voice now edged with something raw, something deeper than mere debate. "These conversations about fairness, they're rarely ever about fairness." Her gaze never wavered. "What we're really talking about is comfort. Whose comfort are we protecting? Whose discomfort are we willing to overlook? And if addressing injustice makes some people uncomfortable, then maybe, Just maybe that's a discomfort we should all learn to live with. The audience erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was something bigger, something louder. People shot to their feet, clapping, cheering, shouting their agreement. It wasn't just support. It was a release, a moment of truth spoken so clearly that it couldn't be ignored. Simone sat back, her posture composed, her face calm, but her eyes still burned with the fire of everything she had just said. Across from her, Charlene was visibly rattled. The control she had wielded so effortlessly at the start of the interview was slipping through her fingers. She reached for her water glass, taking a quick sip to mask the sudden shift in energy. When she finally spoke again, her voice was smoother but thinner, stretched tight. "Well, Simone," she said, forcing out a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're certainly passionate. I can see why your program has gained so many supporters. But let me ask you—" Before she could finish, Simone cut in, not rudely, but with a precision that made it clear she wasn't here to be interrupted anymore. "Before you ask me anything else, Charlene," she said, leaning in slightly, her voice quieter but no less powerful, "let me ask you something." The audience leaned in with her. The shift in energy was undeniable. It was no longer a back and forth. It was a reckoning. "When people tell stories about pulling themselves up by their bootstraps," Simone asked, her words careful and deliberate, "do they ever stop to ask who made the boots in the first place? And who decided which ones were worth investing in?" Charlene froze. The question wasn't rhetorical. It was a blade, cutting straight to the core of the argument she had been pushing all morning. The silence that followed wasn't Simone's to fill. It belonged to Charlene, to the moment she had been forced to confront. For the first time, the host, who always had a sharp retort, a quick dismissal, an easy pivot, had nothing. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The cameras zoomed in, catching the hesitation, the flicker of unease. The audience was dead silent, waiting, watching. Then, somewhere in the crowd, a single voice called out, "Say it louder!" Laughter erupted, rolling through the studio like a wave. Applause followed, loud and unrelenting. The moment belonged to Simone. She smiled, warm yet unshaken, as she sat back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Grace under fire, strength without arrogance. Charlene, on the other hand, was struggling to regain control. She finally managed to force out a response, her voice tighter than before. "Well, Simone," she said, her usual confidence dimmed, "I suppose we'll have to agree to disagree on some points." She tried to make it sound casual, dismissive, but there was no mistaking the strain beneath the words. "But I do appreciate your perspective." Simone didn't hesitate. "And I appreciate the opportunity to share it," she replied, her voice steady, her victory quiet, but absolute. The producers cut to commercial, but the moment had already outgrown the studio. The audience was still buzzing, their energy spilling out into the world beyond the cameras. Even before the segment officially ended, social media was already ablaze. Simone Jackson, Morning Perspective. Her words were being clipped, shared, dissected, celebrated. Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. Every platform was flooded with videos of her sharp, undeniable responses. And just like that, the conversation wasn't just hers and Charlene's anymore. It belonged to everyone watching, and it wasn't going anywhere. She said what needed to be said. A single tweet, simple yet powerful, spread like wildfire, amassing thousands of likes within minutes. Across social media, Simone's words echoed far beyond the studio walls. A video clip with the caption, "Putting out fires, not ignoring them," was shared and reshared, picked up by activists, influencers, and even a few high-profile celebrities. Backstage, Simone sat alone in her dressing room, inhaling deeply as she took a rare moment to collect herself. The weight of the interview still lingered, but not as an exhaustion, rather as a fulfillment of purpose. Her phone vibrated incessantly, notifications flooding in, messages from friends, emails from longtime supporters, and countless social media tags from strangers who had been moved by her words. She scrolled briefly, her heart swelling at the outpouring of gratitude, particularly from young women who saw in her a reflection of their own strength, their own potential. But not all responses were in her favor. As expected, there were critics, voices accusing her of being too aggressive, too divisive, too unwilling to play nice. Simone had seen it all before. She knew these comments weren't really about her tone. They never were. They were about her refusal to shrink, to dilute her message for the sake of keeping others comfortable. And she had long since decided that she would never apologize for speaking her truth. Later that evening, Simone sat in her hotel room, the city of Los Angeles sprawling beneath her in an ocean of glowing lights. She allowed herself a moment to reflect. The interview had been tough, certainly, but it had been necessary. An opportunity to challenge narratives, to push back against comfortable half-truths, to speak truth to power. Her thoughts drifted to the young women her program had been built for, girls who might one day stumble upon that interview and see in her conviction a reminder of their own worth. Girls who had been told, time and time again, that their struggles were invisible, that their voices did not matter. Maybe now they would know otherwise. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Her assistant peeked in, grinning. "You're everywhere right now," she said, excitement dancing in her eyes. "CNN just picked up the story. They're calling it one of the most powerful live TV moments of the year." Simone exhaled, shaking her head with a small, tired smile. "It's not about me," she said softly. "It's about the message." Her assistant nodded but held up Simone's phone. "Still," she added, "you might want to see this." Simone glanced at the screen and let out a surprised laugh. Beyoncé had shared the clip. "Well," she murmured, shaking her head in disbelief, "I suppose I can't argue with Queen Bey." The momentum didn't fade. If anything, it grew. For weeks, news outlets dissected the interview. Think pieces analyzed its significance, and social media continued to amplify her words. But for Simone, it was never about the headlines, the retweets, or the fleeting viral fame. It was about the impact. The young women who now understood, perhaps for the first time, that someone out there was fighting for them, making space for them, refusing to let their struggles go unnoticed. That, she knew, was the real victory. But even as the world continued to talk about her words, Simone's focus was already shifting. This moment was powerful, yes, but it was just the beginning. The real work still lay ahead. The next morning, Simone woke to the relentless buzzing of her phone. More notifications, more stories, more voices carrying her message further than she had ever imagined. But she wasn't basking in the attention. Instead, her mind was already racing, thinking of ways to use this moment to propel her program forward, to amplify the voices of the women she had dedicated her life to supporting. By noon, she was back in her hometown, stepping into the community center where it had all begun. A small group of young women from her program had gathered, waiting for her. Their faces, a mix of excitement and determination, told her everything she needed to know. One of them, a 19-year-old named Aaliyah, hesitated before stepping forward. She clutched her phone tightly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Miss Simone," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "I watched the interview last night. I watched how you stood up for us, for all of us. And I just—" She swallowed hard, exhaling shakily. "I just want to say thank you. You made me feel like I can do anything." Simone's heart clenched. She reached out, resting a gentle hand on Aaliyah's shoulder. "Aaliyah," she said, her voice steady but warm, "you don't need me to make you feel that way. That power, it's already inside you. All I'm doing is helping you see it for yourself." Aaliyah nodded, her expression shifting from gratitude to something deeper, something that looked a lot like conviction. Later that day, Simone stood in front of a small gathering of young women from her program, sharing her thoughts on the interview, on the backlash, on the lessons she had taken from it all. "Here's the thing," she began, her voice calm but charged with passion. "The world isn't always going to hand you respect. It isn't always going to hand you fairness. Sometimes you'll have to demand it. Sometimes you'll have to fight for it." She let her words settle, scanning the faces before her. They were listening, not just hearing, but truly listening. And when that moment comes, she continued, I want you to remember one thing. Your story, your voice, your worth, they are not up for debate. Not now. Not ever. The room fell silent, but it wasn't the silence of doubt or uncertainty. It was the silence of understanding, of determination. Simone could see it in their eyes. These young women were ready. They were ready to take on the world. And in that moment she knew, with absolute certainty, that the work she was doing mattered. As she stepped outside into the evening air, the sun dipping below the horizon, Simone allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The road had not been easy. There had been obstacles, resistance, moments of exhaustion that had made her question whether the fight was even worth it. But in the end, she had never wavered. She had stayed true to her purpose. She had used her voice. She had created change. And that, she realized, was all she had ever set out to do. Simone's story is a reminder, a call to action. Standing up for what you believe in will not always be easy. It will not always be comfortable, but it will always be necessary. Whether on a national stage or in the quiet corners of your own community, your voice has the power to ignite change. Do not let the fear of discomfort silence you. Do not let the weight of criticism make you retreat. If Simone's journey has resonated with you, take a moment today to ask yourself, how can I make a difference? Maybe it's mentoring a young person who needs guidance. Maybe it's starting a project that addresses a need in your community. Maybe it's as simple as speaking up when it would be easier to stay silent. Because change is not created by one person alone. It is built piece by piece by those who refuse to look away. And together we can shape the world into something better.